Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I'm continuing with my discussion debunking the conspiracy theory that uh, the mafia had 35th President John F. Kennedy assassinated. Um, so I've done several videos, and I'm just continuing with the discussion, and had started off by going into the origin story of Carlos Marcellus, how he was born in Tunisia to Sicilian parents, and they uh, emigrated to America, to the New Orleans area by uh, you know 1911, and Carlos Marcello was growing up, and he'd gotten involved uh, in petty crime. He'd been arrested for bank robbery and assault. And then he was released. Subsequently, he was locked up again for dealing in marijuana. Marijuana when he was still pretty young. When he was possibly around 19 or early 20s. And he was, at some point he got a sentence of 9 to 14 years. He served 5 years of it, and he got lucky. Um, a politician who was involved who owned some bookie joints, that's you know illegal gambling, by the name of Peter Hand. He was a state legislator in Louisiana. He had, you know, he had spoken with the governor then. His name was Oscar Allen. So Oscar Allen was said to be a stooge of Huey Long. Huey Long had been a governor of Louisiana. He was later assassinated. He was a populist governor, and he became a senator. Huey Long was known to have some mob ties, and he had actually encouraged um, the mob to move over to Louisiana. So between 1934 and 1942, the mob who controlled illegal gambling, slot machines, and they had these pinball machines. Um, they were under attack by the mayor of New York City, LaGuardia. LaGuardia had actually he started a very public campaign against the mafia, against the mob, and he dumped about 1,200 of their slot machines in the Long Island Sound, river, in the waterways, and in an estuary in New York. So he dumped it in the water, and in fact, later on, by 1942, when America was in the war, he was repurposing. He said he was repurposing the pinball machines to use their metal scraps for the war efforts. So he was seizing their slot machines. He was prohibiting illegal gambling, and he was trying to, he was really going after the mafia in New York City. And now you could see, if there was an opportunity to have a politician killed, why didn't Lucky Luciano order a hit on LaGuardia? So it wasn't the thing of the mafia to actually attack politicians. They didn't go after politicians. They more like bribed politicians. They had them in their pockets. They didn't attack. They didn't kill judges. They had them in their pockets. They didn't kill cops. They had them in the pockets. Right? The movie Godfather, where we see Michael Corleone kill a dirty cop. He had to go through the justification. You could see the family telling him that you can't kill a cop, but he's saying, well, he's a dirty cop, and he had him killed. But the mobs don't go after cops. They put cops on their payroll, especially the chief of police of an area, of a mobbed out area and things like that. That's what they do. They put judges on their payroll. They put politicians on their payroll. That's what they do. So their business was being destroyed in New York City. They had an opportunity somewhere else. So Huey Long, who was he was governor of Louisiana, he asked them, he invited the mob to bring their slot machines over to, Louisiana, which they did. And this was how Carlos Marcello got introduced to Frank Costello. So Carlos Marcello, of course, was in prison at this time. He was a young man, and the mob, Frank Costello, they needed somebody to be able to run their slot machines in Louisiana. The appropriate guy. And some people felt, they talked about Carlos Marcello being reliable, being stable. He was a little man. They called him the little man. He was just 5'2", even though he was in prison at the time. Peter Hand, who was a state legislator, he was a politician. He had some bookie joints as well. He spoke with the governor, Oscar Allen, who was a stooge of Huey Long. He had Carlos Marcello released, and his criminal record was expunged. There was no evidence of Carlos Marcello being incarcerated for 5 years for his armed robbery and for what he did back then. So you could see that Carlos Marcello understood the importance of cultivating politicians and not killing them, and the outfit he worked with, again, and it wasn't the style of the mafia to kill politicians. And that's just to re-emphasize my argument that the mafia was not involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. They may have attempted to steal the thunder of the real culprits. That's the KGB, the Soviets, as former CIA director James Woolsey has claimed. In any event, something I want to do is, I want to, like I said, I'm going to go into the origin story and provide a proper background, because if I could provide the structure of the mafia and their MO, their modus operandi, I can make that point strongly that they weren't the ones who assassinated John F. Kennedy, despite what the House Select Committee on Assassinations said, where they seemingly point a finger at Carlos Marcello. They did exonerate. They did say organized crime, the National Crime Syndicate, was not involved, but they couldn't, say, well, an independent mobster did not do it, right? We know that the Louisiana, New Orleans outfit was independent, and so they did say Carlos Marcello had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. But even though they couldn't find any direct evidence linking him to any conspiracy to kill JFK. And of course, G. Robert Blakey, who was chief counsel to the committee at the time, and he was a former Department of Justice attorney. He wrote a book, and of course, another lawyer for the mob, Frank Regano, he wrote a book as well, implicating Carlos Marcello, saying, that Santo Trafficante on his deathbed said that that Carlos Marcello got the wrong Kennedy. Again, that's not an admission of guilt. So that's somebody saying, that's hearsay. That's somebody saying somebody else did it and he killed the wrong person. He's not providing details of how he killed him or how they were involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the Kennedy. Again, that's just hearsay. And a man on his deathbed, and it's a mob boss who's sworn to omerta. They don't talk. He didn't talk throughout his life, and then he's talking on his deathbed to a lawyer who's I don't know. In any event, saying, where the House Select Committee says that Carlos Marcello had the motive, the means, and opportunity, I don't want that misrepresented as saying that, as a scribe imputing, more influence or status than necessary to Carlos Marcello in his ability to assassinate an American president, a sitting president. Um, Saying one has the motive, the means, and opportunity doesn't mean that whoa they have this great power network and they're able to pull strings and have anybody killed. That's not what that means. Um, the lunatic Charles Guiteau, who killed our 20th president, James Garfield, had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. Right? It didn't. It was a lone gunman. Lee Harvey Oswald had these three elements as well. We don't know his motive. We don't know that he hated Kennedy or whatever. Other than we know that he was a he may have been a marionette in the hands of the Soviets, right, of the Soviet government, where he'd attempted to defect to, right. He'd lived in Russia. He'd revoked his U.S. citizenship ostensibly at some point. So John Wilkes Booth had the motive, the means, the opportunity to assassinate the president, Abraham Lincoln, right? Hinckley, the mentally ill guy who attempted to kill Ronald Reagan, had the motive, the means, the opportunity. So having that is no big deal. Anybody, right? But is somebody able to withstand the blowback? You know, to be able to withstand the blowback, you probably have to be a little bit, you know, crazy, right? You've probably got to be nuts, right, to be able to face the consequences of exercising those three elements. You know, working on, you know, any motive or whatever, you know, to assassinate an American president. So I don't want that misconstrued. The motive, the means, opportunity. It doesn't mean anything, right? They're just words. It's just tautology. It doesn't mean anything. It's not saying anything. So going back, you know, we've reached the point now in Carlos Marcello's history where he's introduced to Frank Costello through Peter Hand, and he's introduced to another guy called Castell to help, you know, the New York mafia and even the Chicago outfit to run the gambling operations in New Orleans. So this was going to be his role. And something else that aided Carlos Marcello was that he would marry the underboss of the New Orleans outfit. He married into her, and so that helps in their rise in station. You see, this is very common in amongst the mafia. You know, again, I'm talking about, you know, looking at the operations, how they actually operate. So Carlos Marcello, you know, in the beginning, in the early 20s, in the 1910s, before Lucky Luciano would take over from, you know, with the hits of Masseria, his former boss, and Maranzano, who dubbed himself the Capo di Tutti Capi of the Mafia. That's the boss of bosses, and of course, you know, he was executed. There were those who were called the Mustache Petes, right? They were the more traditional. They were more traditional mafia bosses who had ties. You know, they had actually come from Italy. You see, a lot of these people immigrated from Italy. Carlos Marcello wasn't born in America. He came from Tunisia. His parents had immigrated from Sicily. Lucky Luciano, you know, immigrated from Sicily. So the early bosses, some of them started their criminal activities here in America, like Carlos Marcello, but Masseria, the boss of Lucky Luciano, whom Lucky Luciano had killed, he had, you know, he started his criminal activities in Sicily. So those, the old school mobsters were called the Mustache Petes. And so they had these restrictions in the mafia, right? They had these restrictions like who could be in the mafia, what sort of businesses they got involved in, how they operated. For instance, the older people, the Mustache Petes, they didn't allow non-Italians in the mafia. So you've probably seen these things in the movies. They would not allow non-Italians in the movies. That's a very old, traditional, old school pattern. Some people would not even allow non-Sicilians, right, in the mafia, right? For instance, and this was one of the things that Lucky Luciano was actually revolting against, right? He had the pushback against him and his crew. Lucky Luciano, who was young, was already cultivating, a younger generation of, acolytes like Genovese. Genovese was his, Vito Genovese was his underboss, and Frank Costello. Frank Costello actually was not Sicilian. He was from Calabria. I know Calabria because my roommates when I lived in Milan, Italy, was from Calabria. He told me a lot about these things. I had a roommate from Rome. I had one from Naples. By the way, Al Capone was from Naples. Al Capone was not from Sicily, and so. But Lucky Luciano changed all of that. So we see Lucky Luciano worked with people who were Jewish, like his accountant, Mayor Lansky. He worked with the Irish, I think it was Dutch Schultz, Irish, or Jewish. I can't remember, but he worked with Irish mobsters. He worked with Jewish mobsters. He worked with non-Sicilian mobsters like Frank Costello. Frank Costello was his consigliere. Frank Costello, after Lucky Luciano was locked up for prostitution and got 30 to 50 years in 1936, although he was still the real boss and operating from prison, Frank Costello would take over. But Frank Costello was his consigliere, and so Frank Costello was from Calabria. He was not from Sicily, and so Lucky Luciano changed things. He changed the operations, and this was what gave Carlos Marcello an opportunity to join the mob. And Frank Costello, helped. Frank Costello, who became the mob boss in New York, he and Mayor Lansky actually started to work with Carlos Marcello, because Carlos Marcello's boss, his name was Silver Dollar Sam Carolla, Silvestro Silver Dollar Sam Carolla. He was the mafia boss of the New Orleans family, but eventually he was deported to Sicily by the U.S. government. So he was deported. When he was deported, the commission, the New York families, the commission had to approve the assumption of Carlos Marcello as the boss of the New Orleans outfit. So he was very cooperative with other mob bosses, right? He was very cooperative. He followed the rules. He was very under the radar. He was anytime he got into trouble, they helped him out. You could see how they expunged his record, got him out. In fact, it was a politician, like I said, Pete Hand, who got him out and selected him to be the one to be running the gambling outfits and slot machines in New Orleans, which the politicians in Louisiana had invited Frank Costello and the mob to invest in, to bring over to Louisiana. And so you could see he was a kind of guy, that's Carlos Marcello, was a kind of guy that the mob wasn't really concerned about. They weren't concerned that he was impulsive like a Sam Giancana. By the way, I'll talk about Sam Giancana as well. So even though Sam Giancana was just the public face of the Chicago outfit, the real bosses being Tony Accardo and Paul Ricca, who was in prison. Sam Giancana was known to be very flamboyant. He liked to date Hollywood stars. He was dating Phyllis McGuire, whom JFK was supposed to have dated as well. And there was Judith Campbell as well, another person JFK was supposed to have dated as well. He was very flamboyant. He liked to move around with the stars. He was friends with, Frank Sinatra. So he was just the public face of the Chicago outfit. He was a figurehead. But you could see that the real bosses, they flew under the radar. They were not noisy. They didn't draw publicity or public attention. They didn't even present themselves as being rich. It's funny, Carlos Marcello, when he was now under, when he was indicted and he was being prosecuted, he described himself as a tomato salesman. The mobster Santo Traficante, although he presented himself as wealthy, but he presented his success as coming from selling cigars. He was a cigar salesman. He had a cigar empire, right? But he owned he owned the casinos in Cuba. He owned the casinos in a lot of the majority of the casinos in Florida. Now the Chicago outfit Sam Giancana, they owned casinos in Florida as well. So did the New York family, the Genovese family. They owned casinos in Florida as well. So you can see that even though the mafia bosses had their distinct turf, but they had to work together because Lucky Luciano had changed the organization of the mafia. They were no longer just gangsters, corner gangsters. He had made it into a national enterprise, and they were laundering their money through big business, legal big business. They were joined in by the hip with the unions, right? And there was a lot of money in the unions, and so you can see, yes, that's how Jimmy Hoffa was president of International Brotherhood of Teamsters. That's the Teamsters Union. But it was the biggest union organization, and he was their president, and they had a lot of money, and of course they would lend money, no interest free, which they never had to return to the mob, to the mafia, and they used this to actually build their casinos in Las Vegas, all over America, in different parts. And so you can see they were importantly businessmen. They saw themselves as business people, and they worked with the politicians. They had the sanction of the politicians, so they would not go. It was not in their MO to kill politicians, like I said. So one politician kicked them out in New York City. In fact, publicly humiliated them. LaGuardia dumped over 1,200 slot machines in the river, in the Long Island Sound, river. He dumped it. Public humiliation. Seized their various machines, their tools of operation, and repurposed them for the war efforts. He was banning the mob. He went after them very aggressively. They didn't kill him. They just found another politician who was willing to welcome them. They bribed other politicians, and they moved over their gambling businesses to New Orleans and Las Vegas. They expanded. So again, it wasn't in their style, and Carlos Marcello was the sort of guy who had the equanimity he had the confidence of the mob bosses. Am I saying he was a good guy? It's funny though that when he was now being investigated and prosecuted for the Bry Lab scandal, which was a sting operation that targeted him. They were going to get him because this man operated a $2 billion a year business, and they were going after him. Not because they thought he killed JFK. This was in 1978, 79 when they went after him. 1980. This was about 15 years after the assassination of JFK, right? And so the journalists talked about his personality, his demeanor, and they said he was a very polite, who was cordial. He was very friendly in his demeanor, right? He was very friendly. So he knew how to, glad hand, how to, be amenable and approachable with politicians and even with the public, to give a good, image, respectable image to the public, and so not to say he was a good guy. He was a mobster, right? He had his methods of killing people, and when he killed people, he did kill people, but he was never convicted for murder. When he killed people, it didn't come back to him. Now, he was known that when he killed people, that he would actually put them in a box. People he'd killed who crossed him, but those were fellow mobsters, right? The mafia, you see, they make it a point. They kill other mobsters who get in their way, or if they're in a gang war, if they're in a civil war, they're fighting for turf control or trying to overthrow an outfit, which is rare, right? And they'd have them, kill in a certain way. They said Carlos Marcello would kill his victim, his target, put him in a box, and he would liquefy him. He'd melt him in lye or caustic acid, and he'd go and pour the liquid, the corpse, liquefied corpse in the bayou, and nobody would ever be able to find any evidence they could trace back to him. So that was his method. Again, the way the president was assassinated, that was not his, that was not, it didn't have his stamp, his imprint. They link the commission and other people who've written on this. They link and Frank Regano. They actually say Carlos Marcello was connected to Lee Harvey Oswald because Lee Harvey Oswald's uncle ran one of the the bookie joints owned by Carlos Marcello. Again, for a man we've already said is a major revenue generator in Louisiana. I mean, how is that far-fetched? I mean, there's 6 degrees of separation from the man, right? That's just like saying that if you're in the oil industry in the late 19th century, because you were working there, you would not be connected with John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller virtually owned everything. That was how Carlos Marcello was in Louisiana, in the South. He had enterprises in Dallas as well, right? He had enterprises in Dallas, in Texas. He owned, he was. They said he was a major revenue generator in his business enterprises were the major revenue generator in New Orleans, in Louisiana. So hey, at some point, you're gonna find somebody. It's only 6 degrees of separation to find somebody who works for an enterprise controlled or affiliated with Carlos Marcello. So that's a tenuous relationship. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't say anything. By the way, Lee Harvey Oswald was an unstable loner. More likely to be used by an intelligence outfit that could manipulate him. He'd have a handler who could easily manipulate him, and that was more likely what the situation was. And so Carlos Marcello had he demonstrated the sort of reliability and business savvy that was needed by the mob bosses, and with the politicians found acceptable, corrupt politicians that they could easily buy. We could see how he understood how politicians helped his rise in the beginning. They freed him from prison, so he understood their use, right? It was a politician, Peter Hand, a state legislator, talked with the governor, Oscar Allen, who was a protege, a stooge of Huey Long, right? Huey Long was a famous governor. They said Huey Long, if he had not been assassinated, he would have been president of the United States, right? So Carlos Marcello understood the significance of politicians to his operations and cultivating them. And the way the mobsters, the mob bosses at the top, Frank Costello, singled him out when he was a very young man to help run the joints. They found him reliable. He understood the importance of pleasing the mob bosses, the crime families. He understood, so he wouldn't do anything that would rattle the organization or rattle them. He understood this very early on, before he even became a made man. So you could see this was part of his life, his MO. He wouldn't do anything to rattle them. In fact, the way they got him in the sting operation was because he was actually, he was bribing the number 2 man, the second most powerful man in the Louisiana government. His name was Charles Romer. He was commissioner of the administration of the governor at that time. So he cultivated relationships with them. But unfortunately for him, the FBI had been bugging him. They'd been wiretapping him. They sent undercover agents, informants, people to set him up, right? So he was entrapped in the enterprise. So he knew. They said this man used to talk under the table, right? They knew they were being wiretapped. They were being bugged. When would they have the opportunity to actually go and plan the assassination of the president of the United States of America? There was a guy, Gigante, who succeeded Lombardo, who had succeeded Genovese, who was boss of the Genovese crime family. They said he was the one who was faking to be insane for 30 years, You were never to speak his name. He could kill somebody for saying his name. Nobody referred to him by name. They would do signs, do a C, they do signs, do a C, you know, use something, but they would never call his name. So Carlos Marcello was said to speak go under the table and start speaking, so they understood that they were being followed, they were being wiretapped by the FBI, and of course that was what eventually led to his conviction. Even though this was overturned later on, but by this time, he had Alzheimer's, he had dementia. So again, this is just a little thing that I've done to try and demonstrate that Carlos Marcello, wasn't erratic enough and he couldn't pull off the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and the family would know. And by the way, if the mafia's motive, that's Carlos Marcello and Sam Giancana and Santo Trafficante, whom the Kennedy administration, whom Robert Kennedy had gone after very aggressively after, right? If their objective was retribution and to get rid of the inquisitor, Robert Kennedy, why didn't they kill Robert Kennedy directly? Why kill JFK, the president, which was more likely to have a bigger blowback one? And JFK wasn't the one going after them. JFK had his plate full. JFK was dealing with USSR, right, with the Cold War. JFK also had his very ambitious agenda to land a man on the moon. He had his ambitious civil rights program agenda, which was subsequently taken up by his successor, LBJ. So why kill JFK? Again, these are business people, the mafia, the mob bosses, they were business people. They were not ideologues, right? It's ideologues like the communists in Russia. They're the ones they'd kill you for free. That's another thing. There was never any trace. If the mafia had enlisted the aid of Lee Harvey Oswald to assassinate John F. Kennedy, you'd see a trail, right? A trail of money. They have lots of accountants and lawyers who can trace money. There was never any trace of money that Lee Harvey Oswald was paid anything. They checked everything, his bank account. He was a poor man. He had very little, a man of very meager means. He lived that way throughout. There was no trail of payments to Lee Harvey Oswald. He wouldn't do it for free for the mob. He'd do it for free for the Soviets, because as an ideologue, right? As if he's an intelligence agent, if he's a double agent. So that's why the American government has feared the ideologues the most, right? There was nothing that terrified the American government officials like ideologues, the communists, because those people would just do things. Ideologues can be very dangerous, right? They're dangerous people, right? Unlike somebody who's doing something for, his motive, he's just doing it for money, right? There's no paper trail showing that the mafia paid Lee Harvey Oswald to have JFK assassinated, so you can't connect them, right? Later on, his widow, people who felt Lee Harvey Oswald was actually a patsy, they sent her some money, donations and things like that, because he had kids and people just thought, okay, he was a patsy like he said, and the mafia had him killed. And of course the mafia, just to boost their image, again steal the thunder from the Soviets, they let the notion circulate that they were the ones who had JFK assassinated. But of course you will never find any evidence linking them, because you can't find evidence for a crime that was not committed. The mafia didn't commit the crime, so that's why there's just no evidence linking them. They didn't commit the crime, so you can't find any evidence against them. So it's okay for them to exercise their First Amendment rights and lie. It's not a crime to lie or to misrepresent things, to say, hey, yes, that they killed the mafia. No, it's a First Amendment right. It's not a crime. So, and that's that. Again, I don't like to tell a one-dimensional story to make it seem like, Italians are, prone to crime, especially since I gave the origin story, the backstory of how the mafia came up. So I decided I was going to say another thing. I lived in Italy and I had a lovely time in Italy. Italians were very nice to me in my school where I went to school, Bocconi University. It's an elite school in Milan. I was very fortunate to attend the school. And my roommates as well, my friends, they were all very nice to me. So you can see respect, respectability, courtesy, still a thing about it, amongst Italians. So if you have that, they will embrace you. And for the most part, people in America, Italians in America, have tried to be that same way, to conduct themselves with respect, respectability, to have that. And so, something I wanted to draw attention to. Many people don't know that the greatest Western movie ever made was made in Italy. They were called the spaghetti westerns, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This was what made Clint Eastwood very popular. Also, Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It was actually made in Italy, and it was directed by an Italian director, Sergio Leone. Sergio Leone is arguably the greatest director of the 20th century. He made a lot of great movies. He made Once Upon a Time in America, starring Robert De Niro and what's his name, James Woods. And incidentally, it was about the mob, right? It was about the mob in New York. And so Sergio Leone, he was the one who produced the Dollars trilogy. Fistful of Dollars, Fistful of Dollars, for a few dollars more, and of course the good, the bad, and the ugly, and starring Clint Eastwood, right? And you can see how remarkably done that movie was. It's a classic. Everybody knows the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so they were called spaghetti westerns, right? And so Italy was, they made great movies back then in the 50s and the 60s. So spaghetti westerns in the 70s. There was also Trinity. When I was a kid in Nigeria, I used to watch the Trinity movies. Interestingly, while Clint Eastwood was an American, a lot of the stars in these movies were Italians, even in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Many people who acted in it. So there are voiceovers, obviously, like the sergeant, the corporal to the sergeant Lee Van Cleef, the big fat, big huge corporal who had a huge beard. He was actually Italian, right? He was an Italian man, and I'm not talking about Italian American. He spoke Italian and everything. So they used voiceovers. So they had a lot of Italian actors. That guy looked for a long time. I used to confuse him with Bud Spencer. Bud Spencer was a guy who was another Italian, and so they changed their names, Bud Spencer and Terence Hill. Both of them were friends and they were partners in crime. They were always doing these movies. Trinity, right? Trinity, Steal My Name. They call me Trinity. They were very popular, when I was growing up. I watched them as a kid in Nigeria. They were once very popular in America, so they're called spaghetti westerns. So those guys, even though they had American names, they were Italians, lived in Italy, born in Italy, they acted in Italy, but they changed their name. So the idea was to appeal to the American market, right? And so that's just something I wanted to put out there. I think I pretty much covered it. That Carlos Marcello, even though the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978 said he had the motive, the means, and opportunity to kill JFK, but they had no direct evidence to do it. Again, he actually wasn't. There's no real, and they admit there's no real evidence linking him. I'm debunking it. I'm saying it's just a myth that he had anything to do with killing JFK. It was not in the MO of the mob, and he acted independently. If he was acting independently, he would not do something to rattle the commission or the New York families, the Chicago outfits. Of course, they're saying Sam Giancana was involved in it with him. Again, Sam Giancana was prone to bloviating, but of course, saying somebody should do something and bloviating, and a man who was wiretapped throughout. He knew he was wiretapped. He was so paranoid. He actually took the U.S. government to court, and he won. because they were surveilling, or because of their constant surveillance, when would he have time to? He was actually, I've heard the wiretap, of course it's out on the internet, where he was saying they should kill Kennedy by stabbing him and killing his family, right? When is he going to have an opportunity to actually conduct a conspiracy to kill JFK? And we wouldn't have that recorded, right? So that never happened. So let me stop here. It's gotten pretty long. Again, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I talk about American presidents, and that's, I'm talking about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So it's been incidental, to get into the backstory of the mafia. My interest is not in the mafia, but in, to just to debunk the myth that JFK was assassinated by the mafia. If I provide the structure and the MO of the main actors involved, I could, say I think I could successfully, lay to rest the argument. I can make my point better by showing that the mafia did not kill JFK. At the same time, I draw attention to call of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court. On May 16, 2023, I was swatted, I was framed, I was swatted in my home and assaulted by a SWAT team who locked me in. About 40 cops raided my home, spread disinformation, and they injured me. They shot me in the head with a projectile, left me bleeding. They tear gassed my apartment, removed me naked, and they stole my property, my wristwatches, my cash, my credit cards, my debit cards. They stole my luxury items, dumped me in a hospital, and then to add insult to injury, they filed false charges against me. This was all done to obstruct justice. I was, as of that day, I was an auditor in the Department of the Navy. I had reported fraud and misconduct in the Navy. This was under investigation, and of course the senior leaders involved, the senior executives that I reported, of course they had co-opted the state of Maryland's law enforcement and the Montgomery County court system to file false charges against me and to make me appear dangerous and to assault me. And so they filed false charges against me, trumped up charges. I was the victim of these police officers who actually claimed I assaulted them in my home. They had no arrest warrants. I'd never been arrested, never been involved in crime, not a gangster. I actually hold a top secret TSSCI clearance. I was actually working in the federal government as an auditor, and I'd reported fraud and misconduct. So I was targeted, unfortunately, by corrupt government officials, and there's public corruption in Maryland. They induced a man with senile dementia, Jide Iware, who they can conjure it up as my uncle. He fabricated a petition, all sorts of lies, and so I'm seeing the public corruption in the state of Maryland. I actually have a law degree. I'm a lawyer. I don't practice. I'm not licensed to practice, but I hold a Doctor of Law degree from George Washington University Law School. I graduated from Columbia University. I have a BA from Columbia University. I have an MBA from Troy University. I was an accountant. I've done a variety of things. I was a banker with Bank of America. So I'm a law-abiding American citizen. I go to church. I don't commit crime. It's not a front for me. Obviously, that's why I hold a top secret clearance. That's why I was working in the federal government. But now I'm being framed by corrupt law enforcement and corrupt judges and a corrupt state attorney's office in the state of Maryland. John McCarthy's state attorney's office is corrupted. It's been co-opted apparently by rogue federal employees in the Department of Defense and Department of Justice. Sorry, in the Department of Defense and the Department of Navy, and I'm calling on the Department of Justice and the FBI to give me justice. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.